Hello everyone, welcome to this week's discussion of Utilitarianism, a philosophy put forward by Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th and early 19th century. The central idea of utilitarianism is that when we are considering whether or not we ought to do something, the most important element of our considerations is whether or not the action will increase pleasure or decrease the pain in our lives. In other words, the thing we care most about in every single action, the one thing that we never fail to consider, and really the only or at least the most important consideration in every single thing we do, is whether or not that action will cause pleasure or pain. And that's really it. An action is good if it leads to pleasure and bad if it leads to pain. Now, Jeremy Bentham formalized this in something he called the principle of utility. And the principle of utility basically says that an action is commended or condemned according to whether it produces benefit, advantage, pleasure, good, or happiness, and prevents mischief, pain, or unhappiness. In other words, we decide to do something, or we decide that we should do something if it increases or produces advantages, pleasures, and goods, or if it decreases disadvantages and pains. And we decide that we shouldn't do something, that we ought not to do something, if it decreases pleasures, good, or happiness, and increases mischief, pain, or unhappiness. Notice that while I originally started saying that utilitarianism promotes pleasure above pain in every decision, in the principle of utility we use words like benefits, advantages, goods, and happiness. And that's because when we say pleasure and pain, we don't just mean physical pleasure or physical pain. We mean something like positive consequences and negative consequences, right? Maximizing benefits and minimizing harms. Okay? So there's all sorts of different kinds of pleasures, not just physical ones. Keep that in mind. Right. In fact, it's better maybe to think of it as in terms of just maximizing advantages and minimizing pains. So, an action is said to have good, or in other words, positive utility when it augments happiness more than it diminishes it. So, according to the principle of utility, an action is good, in other words, moral, if it augments happiness, and it is immoral if it diminishes happiness, if it augments pleasure and diminishes pleasure. Now, when we're considering whether to do something, of course, what we do is take into account the amount of pleasure it produces. Jeremy Bentham put forward suggested a straightforward calculation, what he calls a utilitarian calculus. When we're thinking of whether or not we should do a particular action, we're interested in four elements of that action. The intensity of the pleasure the action will result in, the duration of the pleasure that the action will generate, the certainty of the pleasure, whether the action will definitely lead to a pleasure, might lead to a pleasure, might only occasionally lead to a pleasure, and the propinquity of an action, of the pleasure. In other words, is the pleasure going to come very soon, or is it going to be a delayed pleasure? So when considering whether to do something or not, you take into account these four factors. If the intensity is high, the duration is long, the certainty is very high, the propinquity is soon, then that is clearly an action that will be pleasurable, and therefore clearly an action that you should engage in. If, on the other hand, it's going to lead to pain, or it's going to lead to mild pleasure or something like this, then maybe it's something you don't do, or maybe you do something you do only occasionally. And of course, this is just for single actions, right? For example, whether or not you should skip a particular homework assignment. You consider elements 1 through 4. But sometimes we want to think about types of actions. After all, it would be burdensome to have to do a utilitarian calculus for every single action that we do every single day. So sometimes we want to know whether certain types of actions are good or bad. Is it generally speaking good to skip homework? Is it generally speaking good to be charitable? So when we're thinking about types of actions, we want to consider two more elements, fecundity and purity. Fecundity means besides the primary pleasure listed up there, number 1, does it have any secondary, any extra pleasures? Purity means, does it have any extra pains or any secondary pains? Depending on how you answer 5 or 6, then in combination with 1, 2, 3, and 4, you determine whether the type of action is something you normally want to do or normally want to avoid. Finally, there's a further consideration when we're thinking about actions of groups. When we're thinking about whether a group ought to do something or whether an action is good for a group, we also want to consider the extent. And extent here just means the number of people that are affected. So, if I want to, say, give an extra credit assignment, my responsibility is to consider how many people in the group are going to be affected, not just the pleasure and pain caused by an extra credit assignment. A quick word about groups, besides that, the elements of utilitarian calculus. Jeremy Bentham actually thought that there is no such thing as what might be called the interests of a group. A group does not have its own interests. What happens is you have to consider, what you consider is the interest of all of the individuals in the group, and then add that up. So in other words, if I want to know whether it's good for the class group to have an extra credit assignment, then I have to consider whether it's good for each individual in the group, add up the results of my considerations, and the sum of the interests tells me whether it's good for the group or not. To recap, the central idea of utilitarianism is that morality depends on pleasure and pain. If an action leads to pleasure, and again, this is not just physical pleasure, if an action leads to pleasure, then it is a morally good action. If an action leads to pain, it is a morally bad action. This is a perhaps counterintuitive version of ethics, but Jeremy Bentham argued elegantly for it. And as a result, and it actually, a lot of times, it does seem to work out properly with our intuitions much of the time. There's one more thing I want to point out about Jeremy Bentham. He was kind of an odd guy, and when he died, he had his body donated to science to be autopsied, on the condition that his skeleton and head would be displayed at London College University. And so, if you go to that university in London, there is actually a display case where his skeleton is inside of the clothing, and his head, his actual mummified head, is at the feet of the body. The head you see on top of the body is actually a wax replica. I just thought I'd add that. Have a good week, and I'll see you next week when we're talking about ethics again.